Track 3. Continuing Biography of an Idea, Memoirs of a Public Relations Counsel, by Edward L. Bernays. Wall Street knew Cord as the man who could do the impossible at a profit. He had built and marketed an automobile with a front-wheel drive, the Auburn, despite the verdict by engineers that it could not be done. He had successfully speculated in the stock market in the rise of the 20s. His Auburn car had led the 1929 price rise in the stock market by reaching $5.14. He was in control of two other companies. One manufactured Stinson airplanes, and the other the Lycoming airplane engines. In the spring of 1932, Cord looked about for a way to get rid of his recently acquired Century Airlines and the Century Pacific Lines, which operated in the Midwest and along the Pacific coast. Without government subsidy for carrying airmail, they had lost much money. He sold the losing airlines to American Aviation in exchange for 5% of American Aviation stock. He had then increased his holdings in American Aviation to 30% of the stock in November 1932. Harriman, chairman of American Aviation, had been glad to buy Century. It had made a nuisance of itself in the industry, charging low fares and making flagrant efforts to secure mail contracts in Washington. With two associates of his also elected directors, Cord, shrewd, aggressive, and acquisitive, now became a director of American Aviation. On November 10th, in a bombshell report, the New York Times reported dissension among American Aviation owners. American Aviation, the story said, was negotiating to purchase and take over North American Aviation, whose transportation system would supplement that of American Aviation. North American Aviation covered the eastern seaboard below New York and would join the transcontinental run at Atlanta, and would meet its Boston-Montreal section at Newark, and would give American Aviation a national coverage east, west, and south. Cord, from Beverly Hills, sent a telegram protesting the merger and said he was vigorously in opposition to the purchase and its terms. He said that, in his judgment, the sale was neither advantageous or to the best interest of the Aviation Corporation or the North American Aviation Corporation stockholders, and was being furthered by a few selfish people. Cord added that he would fight in the courts and in Washington. Cord had heard that American Aviation wanted to purchase North American by issuing new American Aviation stock in exchange for North American Aviation stock, which would cut his interest in North American Aviation from 30 to 15%. Almost simultaneously, the newspapers announced that Herbert Bayard Swope had resigned from North American Aviation as a protest against alleged secrecy in the proposed purchase. Swope said he would not remain a dummy director. At this point in the battle, I was asked to advise American Aviation in winning over a majority of the 28,000 stockholders. In full-page advertisements in the dailies, Cord had asked for proxies for a special stockholders meeting so that the board of directors on December 21st, 1932, might be increased from 35 to 68. It was Cord's hope that he could increase his membership control to 36 members of the board. GHQ for the battle was in the Equitable Building at 120 Broadway. General John F. Orion, director of the company, was field marshal, working with strategists Robert Lehman and W. Jet Laux, attorney for Aviation Corporation. I seldom saw Lehman. He seemed a shadowy character who slipped in and out of rooms. Laux was fat and bluff. The fight was all in his day's work, the kind of law practice he evidently liked, trying to marshal resources to win battles. Such activity had little to do with what I had thought of as legal practice, but much to do with strategy and with people. The general was a well-known character. He was well-liked for his down-to-earth joviality. He had an Irish twinkle, a gray, bristly, well-groomed mustache, a military bearing, and a good sense of humor. He treated his job of marshalling proxies not as a battle for money and power, but as if he were at general headquarters in France, deploying his forces over the terrain in an organized way. His field directors, who were to collect the proxies, received mimeographed instructions worded in the style of orders given on the field of battle. The actual drive for securing the proxies, as hereafter provided, will not be commenced in the field until a telegraphic or telephone order to do so has been given the field director by the undersigned. The probable date for giving of the order will be in the afternoon of November 10th or the morning of November 11th, Armistice Day. The sign of the Depression was a statement in the Manual of Instructions issued by the General, which said that field directors should employ necessary canvassers at an average rate of $2 to $3 per day. By directly checking the checking accomplishment of each canvasser and promptly discharging those who do not deliver, a thrifty standard of accomplishment will be maintained. This instruction came not from sweatshop operators, but from a representative of most respected bankers of the period, Messrs. Harriman and Lehman. Occasionally, the General turned a telegram over to me with a smile. I filed and forgot it. But it showed then as now how naive some people are about the news-gathering processes. A field director seeking proxies wired from Atlanta that the Associated Press dispatches from New York friendly to Cord, pouring into this area, should be stopped. Dispatches based on Mr. Cord's full-page ads were making news. Cord backed his attack by going to the courts in Delaware and obtaining a temporary injunction restraining the directors of Aviation Corporation from acting on the transaction on November 10th. The Delaware courts granted it, but Avisco was able to have the injunction lifted in a few days by the Delaware court. At that moment, Cord rushed back to New York to fight with full publicity, although American Aviation was willing to hold up the deal temporarily. Cord, in his request for proxies, charged that the assets of North American Aviation, for which 2 million shares of stock of Aviation Corporation were to be issued, were worth less than half of the value of the stock proposed to be issued for their payment. Mr. Cord, in his full-page advertisement in New York and other cities, said company control was held by a small group of New York bankers who together owned less than 7% of the total stock. He said that these men had given the New York Stock Exchange a consolidated balance sheet which showed assets of approximately $54 million soon after the founding of the company. Assets today, according to the balance sheet, were about $16 million. He accused them of losing $38 million of stockholders' money in 3 years. He ascribed the loss to profligacy, spendthrift practice, gambling, remission of officers' debts, and other kinds of mismanagement. After the injunction was issued, Cord said on November 10th that he was opposed to the company funds being used in stock market trading and speculation in aviation and other speculative securities. Regardless, he said, the company should do no more speculation with the stockholders' money, and money should be kept in cash and securities, such as U.S. Treasury certificates, to be used as a reserve for future development purposes. He accused the management of secretly issuing nearly 2 million additional shares for less than it was worth, with a secret understanding to vote this stock for a period of 10 years, thus depriving a majority of the stockholders from exercising their rights and keeping secret the account of mismanagement for 3 years and loss to the company of $38 million. He boldly attacked a coterie of bankers, a popular group to attack. The newspapers recognized the potential of this battle for the control of a burgeoning industry and gave widespread publicity to the fight, often in front-page stories. The headlines read, "Proxy Battle Starts to Gain Control of Aviation Corporation. Rival Factions Ask for Support of Stockholders, Hurl Charges. Fight Centers on Plan to Acquire North American Aviation." Cohu's answer, in a statement we released, said that the contest was the culmination of the battle begun when Cord entered the Aviation Corporation, and insisted that present planes and engines be discarded and be replaced by Stinson planes and Lycoming engines which were manufactured by Cord. With so much at stake, I convinced the powers at 120 Broadway that we should proceed on a strategically sound plan. Name-calling would only confuse the stockholders, I said. The issue should be fought along other lines. I laid out these lines and presented them in a manual of strategy, which I gave to Laux and General Orion. The choice for the stockholder should be that between a company with a splendid record, headed by men of integrity and ability, and a stock market manipulator, speculator, a one-man dictator. I urged that the Avisco forces coordinate and correlate all their activities, newspaper publicity, mail pieces, advertising, and personal solicitation by canvassers, and that every effort avoid creating a mental picture of two groups attempting to gain control of a company. I believed that right was on our side. My memorandum outlined a two-pronged action: to build American aviation among the stockholders, and to have others, not American aviation, deflate Cord as an individual. I suggested that airplane pilots, labor organizations dissatisfied with Cord's treatment of them, and individual stockholders, committees, and stockholders might do this. If Cord was the man American aviation's officials told me he was, the way to deflate him was not by their statements, but by facts presented by disinterested parties. Next day, November 12th, newspapers headlined that Cohu and Cord were fighting for aviation proxies. Cohu, in a letter to stockholders, now charged that Cord was attempting by manipulation, injustice, and other devices to take over the company. Cord, not mentioned by name, was referred to as a certain maker of airplanes, airplane motors, and automobiles, who, in an endeavor to sell your company his products in his own interest, is attempting to gain control of your company by manipulation, injunction, and other devices. Cord categorically denied Cohu's statement. He defended his Stinson plane against the charge that it was unsatisfactory and unsuited to the Aviation Corporation's use. Ralph Hendershot, the knowledgeable financial editor of the New York World Telegram, remarked that this was the first real battle the street has witnessed in years. American Aviation did not want Cord, he said, since Cord has a subsidiary, one of the leading manufacturers of single and multi-motored cabin cruisers. A deal between Nabisco and North American Aviation, on the other hand, might mean much to Curtiss Wright, in which North American held a major interest, said Hendershot. Fiorello LaGuardia, a publicity-aware congressman then, injected himself into the battle on our side and gave publicity to a letter he wrote the Postmaster General that pilots were entitled to the full protection of the law and the moral protection of the government, for subsidies were being paid to the companies with the understanding that the personnel and equipment must be of the best. As a result of Mr. Cord's action in reducing the wages of his aviation personnel to demonstrate his drastic economies in airline operation, many of the best pilots resigned, Mr. LaGuardia declared. To take their places, pilots were hired who had been out of work for years. And now we dramatized our labor support. In March, Edward F. McGrady, the American Federation of Labor legislative agent, had testified before a congressional committee on airmail subsidies about Cord's poor labor policies. He said Cord was arrogant, unreasoning, and dictatorial. On November 16th, William Green, president of the American Federation of Labor, issued a powerful statement from Washington, the first time in the history of American labor that the Federation had taken a stand in a proxy battle, and this was in favor of American aviation. The story received front-page play in newspapers with such headlines as, "Labor enters Aviation Corporation control fight. President Green announces he favors President L.T. Cohu. Sharp attack on E. Cord." Green threatened to take up with Congress his opposition to Cord. Cohu now issued a statement supporting Green. It all looked as if we were winning. Now at our suggestion, individual stockholders wrote letters to their fellow stockholders. And on their own, airline pilots from airmail and passenger routes all over the country made news by gathering proxies for the Aviation Corporation management in their spare time and off days. Ex-Governor Trumbull of Connecticut next formed an independent proxy committee. In his next advertisement, Cord attacked Trumbull as one of the principals in the sale of Colonial Airways to American Aviation, and said that General Orion had been one of his principal associates. But Trumbull carried on. Early in the fight, I had learned by the grapevine that the Cord interests seriously believed they had a definite basis for their accusations, that debts of officers and employees of the company had been forgiven without cause, that mismanagement and losses of money could be proven, that officers of the company had performed certain acts without authorization. I also learned that Frank A. Vanderlip had come out for Cord in return for financial advantages to him if Cord was successful. But I had discounted these as false rumors, and believed that our righteous side would win. But I was in for a great surprise. While the battle was at its hottest, I learned, again from the grapevine, usually financial editors, that negotiators were meeting uptown to work on a settlement without my direct knowledge. The case apparently wasn't as clear-cut as I had been given to believe. Virtue versus sin. And while we were still firing duly authorized releases aimed at the enemy, I was informed of the settlement, or, as it might possibly better be called, the capitulation. Cord was to appoint 5 directors to the board. 5 more were to come from management, and 6 impartial directors were to be approved by both factions. They would take the place of 30 directors previously on the board. The hectic activity of the past few weeks was over. The accusations and counter-accusations would be forgotten before American Aviation went before Congress again for its mail subsidies. I'd had an experience in Wall Street warfare, the power play for money, the use of a stance of strength to facilitate bargaining in a back room. I'd also learned to discount my own naivete in accepting statements at face value. After termination of my association with American Aviation, North American Aviation, in a letter to stockholders, announced suspension of negotiations for a merger. The next day, the Aviation Corporation Board met and delayed the selection of a new board. Cord left New York and announced that he had no bad feelings about his former enemies, the bankers, and that negotiations were progressing. On November 30th, a new board of 16 directors was elected in accordance with the backroom plan. On December 7th, L.T. Cohue resigned as president. An item in the New York Times of December 7th, 1932, closed the record. It is reported that after the stockholders' meeting, Mr. Cord declared that his entire dispute with the old management had been amicably settled. The article said, "In the belief that aviation was the lowest-cost transportation ever devised by man, the Cord Corporation invested $10 billion in various aeronautical enterprises, including its commitment in approximately 950,000 shares of Aviation Corporation stock, approximately 34% of outstanding shares." As it was for most businesses, 1932 was also a bad year for General Motors. The company, although it sold over $1 billion worth of cars at retail, saw its profits plunge from $115,220,507 in 1931 to $164,979 in 1932. General Motors still had 134,000 employees, 20,000 dealers, and 296,000 stockholders. Its net sales had dropped 46.6%, but business went on as usual. In December, Paul Garrett, newly appointed Public Relations Director of General Motors, asked me to promote General Motors in connection with the January Auto Show at Grand Central Palace in New York. He told me General Motors could not afford my regular fee. I agreed to $5,000. As I entered the director's room at company headquarters at 1775 Broadway, my first meeting with the high command, the members of the executive committee of the board were seated at a large horseshoe table. Alfred P. Sloan, Jr., president and chairman of the executive committee, presided, a gentleman with a very high, stiff collar and horn-rimmed glasses. The group, wealthy even in the Depression, was so conservative that a new idea was automatically suspect. They had no idea that a broad ideological revolution was taking place under their noses. They still believed we were in an economic depression, which would adjust itself because depressions always do. I expected them to reject ideas voiced by a new young man who prescribed new treatments for old and new industrial ills. They followed precedents they did not want to establish. I didn't have much hope for new notions. But Sloan, in public relations at least, was no troglodyte. I told the meeting it was desirable to attract an attendance of liberal spenders to the show and to use the exhibits to promote the sales appeal of the new line of cars. We worked out a formula on a percentage basis. We would put 40% of our emphasis on the sales appeal of a window innovation that prevented drafts, 35% on more value for less money, and 25% on the new composite bodies of wood and steel. I recommended concurrent activities to stress these three new selling ideas of the 1933 line. For no-draft ventilation, we would organize a small committee of experts to push for better ventilation in transportation. We would try to get public opinion behind this idea. For the composite steel and wood bodies, we would enlist support from engineers for this innovation. And to further quality maintenance, we would find an organization willing to espouse the idea that high quality represents a better investment for the customer than buying cars because they are cheap. I suggested Mr. Sloan give 3 luncheons to emphasize the new technology in General Motors cars, to point to motoring as a new force for international understanding, and to stress motor cars in a depressed economy. Results of our efforts became visible to the public in a few weeks. Eli Jacques Kahn, the architect, who enjoyed being in the forefront of constructive movements, consented to head a Metropolitan Committee on Better Transportation Ventilation, which gained widespread publicity on its initial announcement that it would agitate for improved transportation ventilation. General Motors followed Kahn's announcement with one that their 1933 cars assured the ventilation the committee was agitating for. My friend Percival White, an engineer, carried on a correspondence with the press and with engineers on the advantages of the composite automobile body. And on quality maintenance, Hartford Powell of the National Retail Dry Goods Association, who was furthering this idea for them, added our appeal to his own. Sloan's first luncheon to honor auto pioneers early in January dramatized technical advances. Speakers emphasized motoring difficulties of the past, and Charles F. Kettering, vice president, described the many innovations General Motors had originated. The patter he used reflected the era of the copywriter's paradise: no-draft ventilation, inertia shock absorbers, the octave carburetor adjustment, the starterator. Words sold the product, a throwback to the abracadabra of the medicine man. To emphasize the impact of technical research on society, I had asked Sloan to send telegrams to 200 American leaders in education, finance, and industry, pledging that General Motors would continue its research and develop new inventions and products in spite of the Depression, and asking for their comment on the place of research and technology in American industry. Sloan called a press conference on Sunday, January 8th, the day before the Auto Pioneers Luncheon, to ensure front-page stories for the lunch next day. Our release, Progress and Momentum of American Trade and Production Go On in Spite of Depression, over 150 of America's foremost leaders reaffirmed belief in this principle in statements to Alfred P. Sloan, Jr., President of General Motors Corporation, appeared on the front pages next day. Mr. Sloan, who had been skeptical before, was pleased at the attention given the luncheon. It was apparently a revelation for him to learn that ideas could be projected quickly and with effectiveness. In a letter to me, he mentioned the constructive work we had done during show week. He admitted that he had not been sure of the program when we had discussed it, but now, considering its various aspects, he was pleased both with what had been done and how it had been done. He stated his belief that this was the sort of activity the company needed. He didn't think it was essential to keep up this tempo, but thought the company should proceed vigorously. I interpreted his sticky language to mean that Mr. Sloan wanted to move ahead. Within the hour, Paul and I concluded an arrangement for me to become counsel on public relations to the General Motors Corporation. I was invited to Detroit, the first of many such weekly visits in General Motors' special car on the Detroiter. A director of General Motors, C.T. Fisher of Fisher Brothers, talked to me about a long letter from Sloan on public relations and the deep impact the show week public relations had made on Sloan. He was won over to public relations. Sloan said that prestige should be built for the Fisher bodies, and that other matters about the bodies were secondary. Aggressive publicity, he thought, would be more effective than advertising. He emphasized in an involved and roundabout computation that he had spent millions for advertising, but if he had spent less for advertising and had spent a tenth of what he had saved for public relations, the balance and the position of the company would now be better. Sloan said he had no objection to spending a reasonable amount of money for advertising, but it would be a mistake to spend too much, and he pointed out that as important as advertising was, the company could ill afford it now. Operations had to be tight until the trend changed distinctly. He believed that public relations was much more effective than advertising, which cost a terrific lot and was so overdone that it was almost impossible for copy to carry conviction. Public relations, I now felt, was an important factor to the company, and that meant to many companies in the United States that followed General Motors' lead. Mr. Sloan now acted to integrate public relations more fully with company activities. He accepted my suggestion to educate the executives of 51 subsidiaries on public relations. A barrage of material went to them from several sources. A booklet containing the telegraphic responses that had come in answer to Sloan's inquiry about science and invention. Eli Jacques Kahn wrote them about no-draft ventilation. 500 attractive desk presentations told the public relations story as adopted by the General Motors Public Relations Committee. And 700 executives received public relations mimeographed newsletters. Sloan put public relations forward as a must for other corporations. Said Sloan, "It is recognized that the corporation's most vital relationship is with the public. Its success depends on a current interpretation of the public's needs and viewpoints, as well as on the public's understanding of the corporation's motives in everything it does. In order to formulate its policies in harmony with this basic principle, no effort is being spared to analyze and evaluate the public, forming the corporation's actual and potential customers, in its thinking with respect to all things in which the corporation plays a part." The public relations meetings at General Motors, presided over by Garrett, took up such matters as getting a speechwriter for Sloan, the corporation's obligations to educational institutions and consumer research. They discussed the coordination of the public relations of the divisions with the company public relations program, the Motors Silver Jubilee, contributions to local and national social service organizations, and how to extend the showing of company talking motion pictures. They covered institutional advertising, stockholder relations, corporation radio policy, and to what extent we should publicize a complaint bureau and consumer research. They deliberated on the best public relations program for General Motors exhibits at the World's Fair in Chicago, the possibility of publishing a General Motors magazine and an economic bulletin, articles in the Saturday Evening Post, an electric sign on the roof, and a banquet of the Fisher Body Craftsman Guild. We had made progress in 6 months. Some of the activities merit comment. Consumer research, a new management idea, was a forerunner of today's generally accepted activity. A brilliant enthusiast, H.G. Weaver, a loose wheel in the company, worked on the program. Motorists were asked to put check marks in little boxes in illustrated booklets to indicate whether they liked or disliked certain features of automobiles. Company officials, however, thought they knew what the public wanted and considered the survey Weaver's play toy. In April 1933, out of a clear sky, Sloan's acceptance of public relations carried over into consumer research. Weaver was instructed to make a comprehensive proposal on consumer research, and he asked my cooperation. A corollary idea that was also new was the formation of a Consumers' Complaint Bureau. A letter Weaver wrote me in July indicates how novel his idea was. I am convinced that the approach of running a business from the customer viewpoint is perhaps bigger than any of us really realize. He now planned to send 1 million questionnaires to people throughout the country. By September, more sanctions for public relations came about. Sloan wrote to stockholders and said that consumer research aimed to bridge the gap between the producer and the consumer, not only with reference to details of design, but as regards public relations. Consumer research has the implications of an operating philosophy which weighs every action from the standpoint of how it affects the goodwill of the institution. The traditional approach to the consumer, based on the omniscience of the entrepreneur, had given way to the feedback approach. Large corporations, like children, like to wet their feet before taking a plunge. In 1935, before public relations was generally accepted, the Filco Radio and Television Corporation tried me out on a test case before making a yearly arrangement, just as General Motors had tested me out before making a yearly. Sarah Ramsdell, advertising manager of the corporation, wanted help on a project to launch a new high-fidelity radio. He wanted to focus attention on the qualities of this new instrument, its tune range, extended musical range, selector control, tone diffusion, inclined sounding board, electrodynamic speaker, variable bass components, tone control, automatic volume control, shadow tone, and other innovations. I suggested we first should show the need for this instrument. We should set up a straw man and then knock him down. My friend Pitt Sanborn, the distinguished music critic, gladly undertook the first step. He inquired of thousands of music lovers what the role of radio and music should be, suggesting that radio receiving sets had yet to achieve faithful tone reproduction. Music leaders enthusiastically supported Sanborn's thesis. We distributed pamphlets to newspapers containing these responses on radio reception, and they elicited much comment. Newspaper headlines like, "Radio Industry Urged to Develop Improved Radio Instrument," evidenced this. Then we engaged Lucrezia Borri, the Metropolitan Opera star, for our launching of Filco's innovation. We rented the Grand Ballroom of the Waldorf and invited hundreds of distinguished musical leaders to witness our demonstration. Mrs. Charles Guggenheimer, the Minnie of Lewisone Stadium fame, was chairman. Mrs. Henry Alexander, a distinguished New York music patron, and others were members of the group. We broadcast the demonstration over the Columbia Broadcasting System with Bo Carter, Filco commentator, one of the best-known radio figures of his time, as master of ceremonies. Newspapers reported an improved high-fidelity radio was now available. Radio reception was as good as the human voice. Filco and Ramsdell now retained me on an annual basis, a relationship that continued during the next several years. The runner-up in large-scale American industry has special competitive problems. He profits from the leader because the leader's activities spill over to his benefit. He is at a disadvantage because he usually lacks the resources to challenge the leader's number one position. The company, in second place, often is compelled to substitute ingenuity and ideas for money. In 1936, a runner-up, the Kelvinator Corporation of Detroit, makers of electric refrigerators and other electrical household appliances engaged us. General Motors was the leader, and its electric refrigerator, Frigidaire, had become the generic name for all such iceboxes. Frigidaire spent more money in advertising than Kelvinator. It offered better credit terms. It sold on consignment to a greater extent. It used the leverage power of General Motors to enforce its prime position. For example, it did not hold business meetings at hotels, which used a competitive refrigerator. The time was propitious for using the Public Relations Council for electrical household appliances. Just as the automobile had revolutionized the relation of the American to his environment, the new use of electrical energy was revolutionizing his environment at home, creating more leisure for the housewife and greater comfort and efficiency for the family. Kelvinator was aware of the advantages of being number two. It was getting a free ride from the standing, the advertising, and publicity of the Frigidaire. But the problem of identification worried Kelvinator too. Owners of a Kelvinator spoke of it as their Frigidaire, a dangerous situation. 2,100,000 refrigerators were sold in 1936. The great markets for refrigerators and air conditioners, washing machines, irons, dryers, and the whole series of appliances without which no house is considered modern, were still to come. New markets were also waiting for refrigerators in businesses, in offices, for beverage cooling and ice cream cabinets. I found the appliance business highly complicated. Service and sales added to the problems of manufacturers. All kinds of wrinkles developed in new mechanical contraptions after they were sold, and they needed to be attended to. Setting up dealer and service organizations on a nationwide basis was a headache. Fortunately, these problems were not my concern. I would have hated to deal with them. But they were major worries of three men. George Mason, a go-getting young business executive who made business his whole life work. His triggerman, troubleshooter, and doer right-hand aide, H.W. Perkins, and his general sales manager, a friendly, extrovert kind of youngish Santa Claus character, H.G. Burritt. From them I learned that Kelvinator had done much in the early scientific pioneering on temperature control apparatus. We agreed on a two-pronged approach to their problem. First, we would attempt to associate Kelvinator with the prestige and epoch-making discoveries of Lord Kelvin, British pioneer researcher of temperature control. Even those who worked with Kelvinator, let alone the public, didn't associate the name of the English scientist with the company name. If we could capitalize on the past and make the association stick, we could create a new identification for Kelvinator products. We set up the Temperature Research Foundation of Kelvinator Corporation. This body would make temperature research studies and supply authentic information to all interested people. I assigned Margaret Bean in London to the job of scouring antiquarian shops and autograph dealers to find material about Lord Kelvin. She arranged for the British English-speaking Union to hold a luncheon for scientists on September 17th in London to honor the completion of a copy of a bust of Lord Kelvin by Herbert Hampton. The original was in the Kensington Museum. On October 8th, at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., a presentation ceremony took place, and the bust, donated by George Mason, president of the Kelvinator Corporation, was handed over to Dr. Abbott, secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, by V.A.L. Mallet, counselor of the British Embassy. Alanson Houghton, former ambassador to Great Britain, presided. Scientists throughout the world commented on Kelvin's contribution. An editorial in the Washington Star the next day said, "Few incidents in the modern history of Washington have been more stirring or significant than that of the presentation of Lord Kelvin's portrait in bronze." Other editorials and news stories across the country followed the Washington coverage. A brochure about the event with a picture of the bearded Lord Kelvin was sent to every important person in the country who might conceivably write or talk about it. The Temperature Research Foundation needed an authority on temperature control. Edward Heitman, chief engineer, became head, and I organized a group of experts in various fields. Francis Keeley, architect; Warren Persons, economist; Dr. Shirley Wynn, former health commissioner of New York; Lulu Graves, a well-known home economist; and Count Alexis de Sosnovsky, designer. An office with a staff of 7 people was set up to answer questions that came in on temperature research and control, and to communicate with leaders on the subject. The Foundation issued booklets with titles like "Temperature is Health Insurance," "Economist's Appraisal of Domestic Electrical Refrigeration," Scientific Refrigeration in Nutrition and Health, Lord Kelvin and Kitchen Temperature. Kelvinator became equated with leadership. Next, the company built a number of model Kelvin homes in different cities. George Mason signed the statement I wrote for inclusion in the brochures. The Kelvin home was developed in keeping with a fundamental policy, that of serving the public interest as well as the private interest. Kelvin home is but another step in the development of those principles of thermodynamics first laid down by Lord Kelvin, the father of modern refrigeration and air conditioning. The 7-room Kelvin homes were equipped with automatic heating, summer cooling, constant hot water, refrigerator, an electric or gas range, washing machine, dryer, and ironer, all made by Kelvinator. On October 14, 1936, we held a luncheon at the Detroit Athletic Club to call attention to the first of these houses. The publicity revolved around what Lord Kelvin had done for the American housewife. We repeated this performance in other cities, including New York. To my surprise, one day in November of that year, I was called in to announce what appeared to be a strange, incongruous merger. This was in the era when most mergers were made of companies in the same field. Nash, an old, well-established auto company, was to merge with Kelvinator. The new company was to be named Nash-Kelvinator. Wall Street wags quipped about the self-propelled refrigerators that would result, but actually the merger was logical enough. Nash's large dealer organization could be more profitably employed selling, in addition to cars, the diversified line of Kelvinator products. General Motors dealers sold a diversified line such as Cadillac and Olds, and reached both the upper and low-income market. But dealers of Nash had to go it alone. The merger would strengthen management and bring savings in the purchase of raw materials for both products, for steel and similar materials were used in refrigerators and motor cars. One Kelvinator experience stands out, the launching of the new Kelvinator line in early 1937, an event reminiscent of the launching of a new automobile line in the 20s. Maybe even more so because refrigerator companies had the experience of motor car openings to build on. Dealers from all over the country were invited to the event, which was a combination political convention, carnival, pitchman show, and county fair. It seemed as if the selling of refrigerators that whole year depended on the drama with which the new refrigerator was unveiled. The advertising agency for months stretched its verbal muscles to find new names for the slightest changes in mechanical structure. One year, a new armor-surfaced unit in the refrigerator was called a Scotch kettle that saved money. There was a fin-flex agitator and a spin rinse. Usually openings were held in a large theater rented for the purpose. Every device known to the stage was used to enhance the dramatic interest of the new refrigerator, which obviously was only slightly different from the year before. Lowering and raising of curtains, lighting, and speakers enhanced the occasion for the dealers and salesmen. For the February 1937 showing, I had been asked to get the best possible speaker to launch the new line. I chose Senator Royal S. Copeland, M.D., former health commissioner of New York City. Here was the ideal man, at once a health expert, a senator from the Empire State, and a man with a reputation for lifetime concern for the public welfare. I prepared a carefully documented speech for him on the advantages of electrical refrigeration and went over it with him in his hotel. When he came to deliver it before a full audience, he started with, "And now I will read you the speech the Public Relations Counsel has prepared for me." I never lived that down with Kelvinator. Kelvinator executives were dominated by a continuing concern to show a larger profit at the end of the year than in the previous year. They had no formal training for this formidable and intricate task, as so many businessmen do today. They grappled with their problems on the basis of experience, hunches, or the advice of experts who often had as little training as they for the job at hand. Advertising men, for instance, thought in terms of new catchwords for new gadgets instead of analysis of the consumer's needs. Wrestling with these problems, which they understood only peripherally, left them no time for anything but what they were grappling with. They became the tired businessmen of that generation. That America's great complicated economic machine, with its problems of sales, services, engineering, pricing, standards, personnel, competition, and advertising, advanced as it did, is a kind of tribute to something. Maybe it was the absorptive power of millions of people after a depression. Today, possibly, we have grown more mature and don't need the frenetic approach. Or maybe the move toward oligopoly, with a few large firms dominating most of the businesses that were then concerned with hectic competition, have reduced the need for manic dynamism. We carried on for Nash-Kelvinator. Then one day Burritt and Perkins telephoned that they wanted to see me on a matter of urgency. They had bought more inventory of materials than could be used in a recession that had come on suddenly. Would I please cancel my contract immediately? I explained that a contract carried two-way obligations. I had obligated myself in signing it, and was prepared to fill it with personnel and an office equipped to handle their work. Nevertheless, I would be glad to negotiate a contract termination. And that is what we did, with no hard feelings on either side. End of Track 3.